Welcome to part 2 of the tutorial Drafting EQE 2014 Paper A Electricity Mechanics. This is part 2, Organization and Planning. Let's recap the subject. The tutorial is based on the 2014 EQE Paper A Electrical Mechanical. I'm assuming that you have already followed part 1 of the tutorial, the assimilation of information. If not, I suggest you do it unless you're already familiar with the subject. The subject, the invention, is a simple mechanical invention, a nutcracker. It's not terribly electrical, not electrical at all. And it's just as accessible to chemists as it is to software specialists. In part 1, we made ourselves familiar with the nutcracker terminology and made a preliminary purposeful reading to identify facts that could be useful for our end product. Now let's have an introduction to organization and planning. You need to organize the assimilated facts with a view to their finality. The finality is a main independent claim, a set of dependent claims, and an introduction to the description. We will deal with these three aspects in turn. All of our reading and planning has to be focused on the final products. First, let's consider the essential features or possible essential features for the main independent claim. The main claim should, of course, be made up of essential features, but essential for what? Essentiality is in fact a relative concept. It could be essential for defining over the prior art. It could be essential because the client says so. It could be essential to define and to solve the technical problem. It could be essential for operation. And it could be essential for the definition of the invention to be clear. For the EQE client or the examiners, place emphasis on essential for defining over the prior art and also essential for what the client emphasizes as essential. The examiners tend to favor claims that are stripped down to these essential features in order to achieve a claim of the broadest possible scope. Some features essential for operation may be inherent, therefore not necessary to spell them out. I'll talk about that as we go along. Now we'll go into some theory for your organization and planning of the main independent claim. The client provides general instructions, broad and valid claims meeting up to all requirements of the European Patent Convention. They are the client's general instructions to you. The client always presents a patentable invention and always presents all of the ingredients for a claim that is patentable over the given prior art. In the paper, there are a lot of details in a few pages, as we saw. The client, in his letter explaining to you, provides some indications towards the protection he expects. And as a matter of fact, to be acceptable, a claim should have more or less a given scope expected by the client. However, an acceptable claim can be expressed in many different ways. You can see that the EQE drafting conditions contrast to the conditions you encounter when drafting in the office. Now we'll have some theory on planning the acceptable scope of a claim in EQE conditions. For the EQE, a claim of acceptable scope has to meet up to the following requirements. First, it must cover all of the client's described embodiments. Second, it must cover all variations and modifications described by the client. Third, it must not eliminate any useful aspect of protection. Fourth, it must be novel, that is, it has to exclude the given prior art. And fifth, it must be inventive. In other words, it has to solve a problem in an unobvious way, normally over the closest prior art. In addition, the claim must be clear, it has to clearly delineate the scope, and it must meet up to all of the formal requirements of the EPC. Providing your claim, the claim that you draft, meets up to these requirements, whatever wording and structure you choose for the claim will be okay. I repeat, you have plenty of choice for claim wording to achieve an acceptable claim. Now some theory on time shortage when drafting in EQE conditions. In the drafting paper A, time is short. You have 3 hours, I think, and that's not a lot of time to do everything. You don't have enough time to mull over the invention, have a rest period, like, for example, coming back to the invention the next day or the next week, and then having mulled over the invention, instantly write a perfect or almost perfect claim, having worked out everything overnight or during a few days. In the EQE, it's necessary to get to grips with the invention quickly. You have to start drafting a main claim as soon as you have a good idea of the invention, and you have to continue working from there. The sooner you have a first draft claim, the more time is left for adjusting it to an acceptable scope. You can extend the working time on the main independent claim by adjusting it as necessary when you are later preparing the dependent claims and when you are preparing the introduction to the description. So you can work on the main claim for a large fraction of the available time. To cope with the exam timing, you may or most likely will have to change your working habits. You can do this by exam practice on the one hand, and by adjusting your working style to EQE type conditions on the other hand. Let's now consider some more theory for planning the main independent claim. In EQE conditions, you can generate a main independent claim in the following way. Identify essential features, quickly draft a rough claim going in the right direction, revise the draft claim in 2 or 3 passes to come to a claim of adequate scope. Then you can polish the main claim when you are preparing to draft dependent claims and when drafting them, and you can further polish the main claim when you are preparing the introduction to the description and you are considering patentability. As I mentioned before, in this way you can work on the main independent claim for a large fraction of the available time. It's important to maximize work on the main claim because the main claim captures the maximum credit up to 50 points out of 100, and the mark obtained on the main claim drops dramatically with certain errors, as we will see when we come to part 3 of the tutorial. To pass paper A, you need a good mark on the main independent claim. That is a basic requirement for passing the drafting paper A. Now I'm going to elaborate on that, looking at it more from a failure mode before we begin organizing and planning the main independent claim. As we said, major credit is available for the main independent claim and can be lost by a poor main independent claim. You must at all costs avoid being self-satisfied with a first draft main claim and hurrying on to other activities. Most likely your first draft claim is not yet up to standard. You should avoid proceeding to elaborate a set of dependent claims as soon as you have formulated a first draft main claim, without first reviewing or putting into question your first draft claim, and without going back to the main claim to improve it as you go along. You must not come quickly to a roughly drafted main claim and proceed from there. Presenting a weak main claim is the most common fault in mechanical drafting and is a shortcut to failing paper A. Putting in a weak introduction to the description goes hand in hand with an inadequate main claim and contributes also to failure. Now we'll turn to practical organization and planning of the main independent claim using the 2014 paper A mechanical nutcracker as an example. For practical organization and planning of the claim, you can start with a list of key features extracted from the client's letter. I'm going to present you with my list, and you can make your own list. Here's mine. First feature is a nutcracker. It could be a device for cracking nuts, but a nutcracker is fine. Second feature is 2 support elements or 2 support members. They could be plates or cubes or something else. I think there always have to be 2 support elements or support members. The third feature I've put down is at least 3 rods or tubes or connecting elements, and they can be straight or curved. You'll remember that the client said that it was necessary to have at least 3 rods or tubes. He said that twice. There have to be some connectors or connections, which could be ball joints or hinges. That's the next feature. The following feature I put down is a space for receiving a nut between the connecting elements, which was described for all embodiments and seems to be necessary. And the last feature I put down is a nut receiving space that is restricted by relative movement of the support members and connecting elements. I've already selected what appears to be the essential features. In fact, I've concentrated on what I thought were the essential features, and you should make up your own list depending upon your perception of what is essential for the nutcracker. Compared to other EQE drafting papers, Drafting a list of essential elements for the Nutcracker seemed to be relatively simple, and for other papers it may be more difficult to immediately come to a list of all essential elements, and you may have a longer list with essential and non-essential elements from which you will have to subtract or delete the non-essential elements as you go along. To make your claim we don't have a claim yet, we just have a list of features, and we have to convert this list into a definition, and hopefully the definition should cover all of the client's embodiments of the Nutcracker, but if it doesn't, we can adjust the claim as necessary. Let's make a first attempt based on my list, and you should make up your first draft claim from your own list or other starting point that you have chosen. Here then is my first draft claim embryo, a Nutcracker comprising 2 support members connected in spaced relationship by at least 3 elongated connecting elements. I added the spaced relationship and the elongated. Then the connecting elements being attached to each support member. I haven't said how. Then the connecting elements defining a space for receiving a nut. And last feature is the support members are movable relative to one another, such as to cause relative movement of the connecting elements to restrict the space for receiving a nut. Good. Now I have an embryo claim. I'm ready to begin tidying it up and adjusting its scope. The same for you. You have to read and criticize your draft and keep improving it as you go along. The reason or the need for extensive revision is that I made the first draft quickly before fully understanding everything, so we have to review it as we go along. Once you have a claim, a draft claim, you can consider its scope and keep working on it by making changes until the scope is right. So as soon as you get down your first draft claim, it's very important, then you can work on the claim to get the scope of the claim right. So let's now discuss and criticize my first embryo draft claim, and I suggest that you do the same with your own draft. Here are my thoughts on the first draft claim embryo. Firstly, talking about the rod and tube. To be a fair generalization of a rod and tube, we've called it elongated connecting element, but the elongated connecting elements has to be narrow. And I asked the question, narrow compared to what? Should we perhaps specify that the elements are narrow, and should we specify what they are narrow relative to? Second thought that crossed my mind is that the 2 support members face one another in figure 1, or in figure 7 they face one another when the Nutcracker is in a rest position. And to me that seems to be a basic requirement of the new Nutcracker design, and I can factor that into my next claim revision. Next observation is that in order to define the space for receiving a nut, the connecting elements are described as being attached to the support members at spaced apart locations distributed around a central part. So that again could come into the claim in the next revision. And my final thought at this stage on the claim is that when the support members move, they are held by the connecting elements in a spaced apart relationship, in contrast to D2, where the support members move together and apart. So with all of those thoughts in mind, according to my perception, I have proceeded with a revision to the draft, and we will now turn to that. Here now is my second draft claim. I haven't added reference signs at this stage. I'm going to put them in later. The claim reads as follows at present: a nutcracker comprising two support members connected in spaced relationship by at least three elongated connecting elements that are narrow compared to the support members. The support members facing one another at least in a rest position of the nutcracker. The connecting elements being attached to each support member at spaced locations distributed around a central part of each support member, the connecting elements defining a space for receiving a nut between the support members and the connecting elements. Characterized in that, I've put it in two-part form, characterized in that the support members are movable relative to one another while being held by the connecting elements in a spaced-apart relationship relative to one another, such that relative movement of the support members away from the rest position causes relative movement of the connecting elements to restrict the space for receiving a nut. Now, at this stage, the claim seems to be fairly developed, but it's not yet in its final form. On my perception, D2 is the closest prior art, and I tentatively wrote the claim in two-part form, thinking that D2 is covered by the pre-characterizing part of the claim. Have you, in your draft claim, have you decided which, if of D1 or D2, should be taken as the closest prior art? So you can think about that. And we still need to review the claim again, and we'll discuss the second draft with a view to further revision. Here now is my discussion of the second draft. First, the client said that the nutcracker should be made of stiff material. It wouldn't work if it were made of bendy material, and the question I have in my mind is stiff inherent for a nutcracker, or should stiff be included in the claim? Second thought is that the central part of the support members, the definition of the central part of the support members, where the elongated connecting elements are connected, is probably an unnecessary limitation, because the connecting elements simply have to be spaced apart between the support members so that they can receive the nut. And the nut receiving space is a result of the arrangement of the connecting elements. So I'm going to work on that part of the claim to merge the two parts together and to try and simplify the claim wording. Next, I noticed that the support members are movable relative to one another, which is already a feature of D2, which I've taken for the pre-characterizing part of the claim. So it would be a good idea to shift the movement of the support members to the pre-characterizing part in order to have a proper delineation according to Rule 42. Next, we haven't talked much about how the connecting elements are connected, but we could specify that the elongated connecting elements are pivotally attached to the support members, pivotally attached being a generalization of ball joint and hinge. So that could be put in the next draft of the claim. And last, it seemed to me that the restriction of the nut receiving space is progressive to crush and crack a nut, so that could also be put into the draft claim. Now let's rewrite the claim once again, and you can rewrite your claim as a function of any defects you found in it. Now I come to a developed near-finished claim, but still without reference signs. We can put reference signs in the draft, but it means extra work copying them out again. And unless you need the reference signs to avoid confusion and claiming twice the same thing, I prefer to keep the reference signs and put them in the last rewrite. Here now is the claim as it stands at this stage. A nutcracker comprising two support members of a stiff material, in parentheses, as I'm not sure whether or not to put that in, connected in spaced relationship by at least three elongated connecting elements, and also in parentheses, that are also of a stiff material and are narrow compared to the support members. At least one of the support members being movable relative to the other support member, that's okay. The two support members facing one another, at least when the support members are in a rest position of the nutcracker. The elongated connecting elements being attached to each support member so that between the support members they are spaced apart to define a space for receiving a nut. This is a modified part of the claim, which I will further modify later on. Characterized in that each elongated connecting element is, in parentheses, pivotally attached to the support members, and the support members are movable relative to one another while being maintained by the elongated connecting elements in a spaced apart relationship relative to one another, such that movement of the support members away from said rest position causes a relative movement between the elongated connecting elements to, in parentheses, progressively restrict said space for receiving a nut. As I mentioned, I'm still debating whether to put in the stiff and whether I'm to put in the pivotally. Stiff seems necessary to solve the problem of cracking a nut, but it may be inherent. Pivotally attached is complemented by the feature that the support members are maintained in spaced apart relationship, so perhaps that could be simplified. Progressive restrict contrasts with D2's abrupt restriction. At this stage, it's good to make two checks on the claim. The first check is going to be whether the claim contains any unnecessary limitations. In other words, whether we eliminate any embodiment or any variant described by the client. And we'll do that by going down through the claim. And last of all, we'll make a check for novelty, which we'll do on the next slide in a few moments. So let's review the claim for its scope. A nutcracker comprising the first part two support members of stiff material in spaced relationship, three elongated connecting elements, even if they're stiff material and if they're narrow compared to the support members, everything covers all of the embodiments described by the client. At least one of the support members being movable relative to the other support member, that covers the fact that one of the support members could be fixed to the table. The two support members facing one another, at least when the support members are in a rest position of the nutcracker, that covers all embodiments. The elongated connecting elements being attached to each support member so that between the support members they are spaced apart to define a space for receiving a nut. That covers all of the embodiments. each elongated connecting element is pivotally attached or just attached. That covers all embodiments of the support members. The support members are movable relative to one another while being maintained, and so on, such that, and in fact, the claim does not eliminate any of the client's embodiments or any of the client's variations of the embodiments, and we hope it doesn't eliminate too much any useful variations which are not described by the client. So that's the first check. You have to make a check for the scope of your claim, and you should do that as the claim is approaching its finality. And the next check, as I have said, is going to be for novelty of the claim, and I strongly recommend that you make a novelty check comparing the claim with each prior art, piece of prior art individually. Here then is the novelty check for D2. I took D2 as the closest prior art, so D2 in fact corresponds to the pre-characterizing part of the claim, and D2 is novel over, claim 1 is novel over D2 by its characterizing features, the pivotal attachment, if it is pivotally attached, the support members being maintained spaced apart from one another, and the space between the connecting elements being restricted as they are moved. So there is novelty over D2, and we are fairly safe on the novelty for D2. Next, we have novelty over D1. Here we run into some problems. I ran into some problems. Now, I thought that claim 1 should be novel over D1 by the following features: the elongated connecting elements being attached to each support member, so they are spaced apart between the support members to define a space for receiving a nut. I thought that that would differentiate, and also the connecting elements relatively move to restrict a space for receiving a nut. In drafting, I concentrated on D2 as closest prior art. I think I underestimated D1. However, you will notice that, probably quicker than I did, that in D1, the two arms are spaced apart by the connecting elements to define a space for receiving a nut. So the first distinction is not really terribly good. And the second distinction of the relative movement, the connecting elements relatively move to restrict the space for receiving a nut. The only difference over D1 is that the, let me see, yes, if you have to look at D1's figure 2, when the lever 5 is pressed down, the connecting elements move to restrict the space, but they don't move relative to one another. So the only distinction is the word relative. So that is a weak distinction over D1. So I have to revise my claim at this stage to make it clearer that there is a novelty distinction over D1. And I have done that as I've set out on the right-hand part of the slide, to rephrase the first part of the distinction so that, for example, so the elongated connecting elements are spaced apart from one another between the support members and are distributed around a space for receiving a nut defined between. So by saying that the connecting elements are distributed around this space, I have made a clear novelty distinction over D1. Having done that, the claims are more or less in a state ready to go ahead, subject to any further revisions we may make at the last moment during the final rewrite, which we will talk about in part 3 of the tutorial. So we will look for further opportunities to improve the claim as we go along. And now I'll turn to the planning for the development of a set of dependent claims. This can be done in different ways, but one efficient way to develop a coherent set of dependent claims is by following three main steps, which I will do in practice. First, make a list of potential features in the order in which they occur to you. And you can do that first step possibly simply by making marks or yellow highlighting or marginal notes on the client's letter. Secondly, organize the list into an organized sequence with proposed claim dependencies. And thirdly, bulk out the wording of each subclaim so that we have a bulked out set of claims ready for writing up in the final set of claims with reference numerals during the last operations in part 3. Here's my first non-ordered list. I just wrote these down out of my head as they came up. First is connecting elements, which could be rods. The connecting elements are rods or tubes. Secondly, the support members could be specified as being plates or cubes. Thirdly, we could specify that there is a through hole in at least one of the support members. Next, we could say that there is a space between the connecting elements for introducing a nut. I've used the word space, but I correct it later to gap. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we can say there's a handle on the support member or a support member. We can claim that there are 3, 4, or 5 connecting elements. We can claim that there are ridges, protrusions, or non-slip paint, so on the connecting elements. We can say that the connecting elements are of the same length. We can say that the connecting elements are connected at their ends to the support members. We can claim ball joints. We can claim hinges. We can claim the fact that the relative movement of the supports is torsional or turning relative to one another. And we can claim that relative movement of the supports is sideways relative to one another. And I put down as the last 14th subclaim that the faces of the supports are parallel or remain parallel. So that's just a list in, so say, random order. This is what we begin with. The first thing we should do is it's important to organize the structure of the claims before going into their wording. So in the next slide, I'll try and put some order into the list. So here now is my second ordered list of features for the subclaims. 1 is claim 1. 2, the 1 in parenthesis means it will depend on claim 1. And then I'm saying the connecting elements are rods or tubes. 3 depends on 1 or 2. The support members are plates or cubes. 4 depends on any preceding claim. There is a through hole in the support member. 5, any dependent claim, space between the connecting elements, or should be a gap for introducing a nut. 6 could be dependent on any preceding claim, a handle on the support member. 7, there can be 4 or 5 connecting elements. I've dropped from 3, 4, or 5 to 4 or 5. 8, ridges, etc. on the connecting elements, depends on any preceding claim. 9, the connecting elements are of the same length, depends on any preceding claim. 10, the connecting elements are connected at their ends, any preceding claim. 11, any preceding claim, the relative movement of the supports is torsional. 12, depends on any preceding claim, or 11, I'll decide later that the connection is by ball joints. 13 depends on any of claims 1 to 10. The relative movement of the supports is sideways. 14 depends on claim 13 with a question mark, connection by hinges, and 15 depends on any preceding claim. The faces of the supports are parallel. That's the second. The first is a non-ordered list, second is an ordered list, and the third will be a bulked out list. Note that down to claim 10, the order remain in its original order. Yeah, I think it's quite important to try and get the structure to your set of claims. If you don't do that, if you try to write your claims up and then put them together, you'll end up with a scrappy organization. So bulking out of the claims is the next step, which we'll do on the next slide. Now I've written the claims out, but I didn't write out in full the dependencies because it's going to have to be copied out, and I didn't want to waste time doing that. So one is claim 1, claim 2 depends upon claim 1 wherein the connecting elements are rods or tubes. Claim 3 depends on claim 1 or 2 wherein the support members are plates or cubes. Claim 4, any preceding claims wherein at least one support member has a through hole for introducing a nut into said space. So you don't have to have a through hole in 2 support members. Claim 5 depends on any preceding claim wherein there is a space, should be a gap between at least 2 connecting elements for introducing a nut into said space or gap when the nutcracker is in the rest position. Claim 6, any preceding claim wherein at least one support member has a handle that forms a lever arm. So we've limited to at least one support member, and we've specified that the handle forms a lever. Claim 7 is any preceding claim where there are 4 or 5 connecting elements. Claim 8, any preceding claim wherein the connecting elements are provided on their surface with bridges, protrusions, or non-slip paint. So I've simply bulked out the claim wording. Claim 9, any preceding claim wherein the connecting elements are of the same length. Bulking out is not too difficult, and most people can do this quickly. As I said, I'm leaving the addition of reference signs until the last rewrite. Let's go to the last claims, 10 to 15. 10, any preceding claim wherein the connecting elements are connected at their ends to the support members. 11, any preceding claim wherein relative movement of the support members is torsional. 12, any preceding claim wherein the connecting elements are connected to the support members by ball joints. 13, any one of claims 1 to 10 wherein relative movement of the support members is a sideways translation. 14 depends on claim 13 wherein the connecting elements are connected to the support members by hinges. And 15, any preceding claim wherein the 2 support members have parallel facing faces. So that's a fairly reasonable set of dependent claims that we can correct when we're doing the final rewrite in part 3 of the tutorial. You can add reference signs now or later. I prefer to do it later during the last rewrite. So the set of claims is now in a more or less final form, subject to last-minute corrections. We now turn to the final planning operation, which is developing an introduction to the description. To develop an introduction, you need to follow Rule 42.1 by specifying the technical field, the background art, by disclosing the invention in a problem and solution presentation with an explanation how the claim subject matter solves the problem, and you have to explain advantages obtained or disadvantages overcome by the invention. for this planning, you can use a votum for grant as a working format, and I'm going to turn, just in case you're not familiar with the votum for grant, we'll just have a look at a specimen of what the votum for grant is about. So here we have an explanation, short explanation of the votum. The votum for grant is an internal form of the European Patent Office that is filled up by the principal examiner who examines an application to present the patent application. If he thinks it's ready for acceptance, he presents the filled up votum for grant form to his two colleagues on the examining division to have their approval. So that's, in very short, is a votum for grant. So if you think about it, although it's an internal EPO form, if you would like to have a European patent application accepted, which is the case for your draft application that you're preparing in the EQE, you need to convince the examiner to fill up the votum. The votum for grant is a simple sheet with the following headings to be completed by the examiner: prior art, the problem, the solution, and reasons for grant. You can make use of this format to make notes for planning to draft the introduction to the description as a check for patentability of the main claim. Next, we'll see my specimen votum for the nutcracker invention. Here is my votum cum plan, which we'll read through. Prior art, D1. Nut is cracked between pivoted arms with lever effect. Nutcracker has to be modified to optimally crack walnuts and hazelnuts. D2, pre-characterizing part of claim 1. Nut is placed between parallel rods and slidable plates that move together to crack the nut. It can crack walnuts and hazelnuts, but it needs skill to crack a nut without crushing it. That came from the client's letter. The problem. Here is a rough problem. To reliably crack walnuts and hazelnuts without need for special skill. We can review that when we're writing up our description. The solution. With the support members kept spaced apart by pivotal connection of the elongated connection elements, a nut is cracked by moving the support members to cause the connecting elements to reduce the nut receiving space with a lever effect. That comes from paragraph 23 of the client's letter. Reasons why it should be granted. The configuration of support members and connecting elements allows walnuts and hazelnuts to be cracked. The lever effect minimizes strength that a person needs to crack a nut. Now, in my votum, I've discussed both D1 and D2, D2 having been taken by me as the closest prior art. I think it's a good idea to, however you do your votum or your plan, to try to do it on a single sheet as a central planning tool. You can edit and amend this plan or votum sheet as you go along. And doing this is a shorthand way of gathering your thoughts together. It's also good for making another check on the draft main claim for its patentability, especially its inventive step. The notes outline, or they provide you with an outline for the future writing of the introduction to the description. And by going through these notes as you're doing your plan, you are basically rehearsing the writing of the introduction that you will do in the last stages. Of course, when you are writing the full introduction, you will have to amplify the discussion of prior art, and you will have to amplify the problem and solution reasons for the introduction, and so on. But you can do that if you have built up a clear plan in your mind. So this now finishes our planning, and what is next? In part 3 of the tutorial, the end product, we will do the following. We will convert the note form main claim into finished form with reference signs and any last-minute corrections. We will present a fully developed set of dependent claims with reference signs. We will convert our notes, the voting that we've just talked about, into a finished introduction to the description. And in addition to working on our solution, we will consider the examiner's report, what the examiners had to say, and we will analyze possible deviations from the examiner's solution. This now is the final page. So this is the end of drafting EQE Paper A Part 2 Organization and Planning. Please would you continue with the drafting EQE Paper E Part 3, the end product and comments, on a separate YouTube video. À bientôt.